Namaskar, welcome back to Media Scan. External Affairs Minister S. Jaishankar spoke exactly a week ago, pointing out how radicalization is perhaps the only measure to find out Pakistan's GDP. He also said terrorism has been and continues to be the only export of Pakistan. Now, a very interesting research book launched recently tells us how and why Pakistan continues to be not only the nursery of terror, but a terror exporter worldwide.
Its GDP can only be measured in terms of radicalization and its exports in the form of terrorism. Today, we see the ills it sought to visit on others consume its own society. It can't blame the world. This is only karma.
So, with that quick package, I want to introduce you to our guests for this evening. Joining me right now, author of the book that I have just mentioned, Dr. Abhinav Pandya, expert on geopolitics, has been writing profusely on radicalization, the threat of jihadi terror and related issues. Welcome back.
Thank you.
Also joining me, another expert on international terror and related issues, Dr. Gunaratne. Hello, Doctor. Namaskar and welcome to Media Scan. And Abhinav, I'll come to you first. I was going through the opening chapters of your book on Jaish-e-Mohammed, and you know, it's an obvious question that comes to mind. When the whole world is talking about world peace and we are trying to combat terror, why should you choose a terror organization, a dreaded one, to write a book?
Thank you very much, Smita ji. In fact, a very interesting question. So first of all, I would like to clarify that by writing this book, I'm not glorifying a terror organization. The idea behind writing this book was that, India's discourse, India's literature on counterterrorism, terrorism was always missing. We have been the victim of terrorism for last 3 to 4 decades. And we always complain that the Western think tanks never pay attention to our concerns related to terrorism. They are not enough appreciative and they are not enough concerned about our terrorism and security related issues. But the problem is that where is our story? Have we produced enough literature? I mean, we saw that in the 26/11 attacks when some of the Americans and some of the Westerners were killed. Christine Fair and Stephen Tanker wrote a book on Lashkar-e-Taiba, whereas the fact is that Lashkar-e-Taiba has done the maximum damage to India. Now, the question remains is that this organization, Jaish-e-Mohammed, was always, doing its operations silently, discreetly, escaping the gaze of experts and think tanks. So I thought that it would be a great idea to write a book on this, to add value to the global counterterrorism literature and put, our problems, our security and terrorism related issues in the right perspective.
You chose the Jaish-e-Mohammed, but if I'm not wrong, the biggest terror attack ever on Indian soil has been the Mumbai attack, as you just mentioned, which was perpetrated largely by people sitting across the border in the Lashkar-e-Taiba. Why not choose the LAT?
Thank you. So first and foremost, I guess, on LAT, a lot has been written, already been written. Stephen Tanker has written, Christine Fair has written. And secondly, I must say that Jaish-e-Mohammed is one of the most lethal terrorist groups as far as India's security interests are concerned. Twice they have brought India and Pakistan to the verge of war. First, when they attacked the Indian parliament, and second in 2019, when they orchestrated the deadly Pulwama Fidain attack. Besides that, Jaish-e-Mohammed has a very vast Devbandi network in entire South Asia. So in the future also, they are going to be the most lethal and deadly terror group for India. And lastly, I must admit that Lashkar-e-Taiba is like the good boy of Pakistan's army and ISI, because they subscribe to the Ahle Hadith and Wahhabi ideology, which is not very prevalent in South Asia. In fact, in Pakistan, the Ahle Hadith and Wahhabi ideology, they do not even align with Lashkar's motives on several occasions. But Jaish-e-Mohammed has a history of 150 years, the history of Devbandi extremism in South Asia. So, At times when required, they can even flout, they can even go against the ISI. They have a much bigger presence in terms of the terrorism and radicalization scenario in South Asia.
Okay, allow me to take these questions to Dr. Rohan Gunaratne. Is it really true that India sometimes loses out in on the narrative front, even though we have been the victims of terror for over 3 decades now, perhaps because we cannot make our points as forcefully due to the lack of literature and research in the public domain? And also, do you think, as Abhinav has claimed, that the Jaish-e-Mohammed has become so big that it might even completely defy the ISI at any point?
If you look at the terrorism experts globally, there are very few Indians who have made it to the international scene. For example, people like Bruce Hoffman, people like Paul Wilkinson, people like Brian Jenkins. We don't see Indian names. So I have seen in the most recent period, the Asian region has produced a few experts. And I'm very proud to say that Mr. Pandya is one of them, especially because he's published with HarperCollins. So his writings will reach a wide audience. People don't really read the books that are produced by local Indian publishers outside India. The second factor is that Mr. Pandya highlights something that many people do not know. That is, Wahhabism drove most of the groups in Pakistan. But here, for the first time, Mr. Pandya highlights that the particular group known as Jaish-e-Mohammed, or the Army of Muhammad, is driven by a Deobandi stream of extremism. And I think that is going to catch momentum, and maybe many people are going to read his book because he has touched on a topic that has not been hitherto explored in India or globally.
Professor, coming back to your first point, which you made in the beginning, why do you think, despite India having been a victim of terror for so long, there is a lack of research on our part? Do you think there may be discouragement in the academic circles for such a topic, or is there some other reason? Have you ever applied your mind to it?
Recently, that Indian scholars are traveling to the West and studying at the top universities in the Western world the subject of counterterrorism, the subject of international security, the subject of national security. And it's more recently that Indians are publishing in publishing houses that have a global reach. So the Pakistanis are the same. Until recently, most Pakistanis, Bangladeshis, Sri Lankans, they all published in local publishing houses. But today, it is different. People are studying in globally ranked universities. There are very few globally ranked universities in India. Indians think that their universities are the best, but they are not the best. The best universities are still located in the Western world. So I believe that it will take a few more years for the literature coming out from South Asia, whether it is from India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, or Sri Lanka, to reach that global community and for them to know more about what is happening in the subcontinent.
Do you think there is at least some sensitivity growing in the Western campuses for Indian researchers, or at least India's argument on the case?
Now, but I remember Professor Paul Wilkinson, who was the head of the Counterterrorism Research and Training Center in Scotland, and he was one of my mentors. When he came to India once to attend the Indian celebrations, the British defense attaché told Paul Wilkinson, referring to a terrorist attack in India, oh, this is insurgency, this is guerrilla warfare, this is not terrorism. But I think today people have identified that there are terrorist attacks in this region, in the subcontinent, and they regard them as terrorism. So I think there's more awareness, there's more understanding. There is less people saying that terrorism only happens in the Western world or now in the Middle East, but
Yes.
terrorism is a global phenomenon. So I think more people will look at attacks against civilians as acts of terrorism.
Fine. Abhinav Pandya, coming back to you, I was going through the first few chapters of your book, and I was reminded very recently, a few weeks ago, an OTT platform launched a web series which in a way tried to whitewash the role of the ISI in the formation of the Jaish-e-Mohammed, which began with the hijacking of the IC-814 and Masood Azhar being released and going back to Pakistan. Your book very clearly says that from day one, the founding of the JEM has been the brainchild, a project initiated by the ISI. Please tell us a little more on that.
Thank you very much. First, coming back to the OTT platform, well, I must admit that sometimes, when these kind of documentaries and movies are made in India, there is always a lack of sufficient research. And also, I mean, the reason that the data is mostly with the security and intelligence agencies, and these are clandestine matters. So sometimes these, filmmakers, they don't have sufficient exposure to these things. Secondly, regarding the role of ISI, well, we have to look at the fact that Masood Azhar was very important to ISI. Initially, when he was sent to Kashmir, that was because ISI wanted to patch up the differences between Harkatul Mujahideen and Harkatul Ansar, two terror groups active in Kashmir. And then they staged many attempts to get Masood Azhar released. Even before the IC-814 hijack, there was a group called Al Farhan. They kidnapped foreign tourists. Then Omar Sheikh Saeed, who was a terrorist, who was released with this Masood Azhar. He had come to Delhi just to kidnap the tourists and foreigners to get Masood Azhar released. So there were several attempts. There was a jailbreak in Kort Balwal jail.
There was a jailbreak in Kort Balwal. For the same purpose.
Sajjad Afghani died in that jail because after that, but Masood Azhar couldn't get out of the tunnel because he was very fat. And there's a famous incident that the CRPF guards told him that "Mote ye tere bas ka nahi hai," because you're too fat, you cannot get into the physical activities. And then he replied that very soon you will be escorting me very safely and with all the honor to Pakistan. Now, if he's saying that you'll be escorting me,
to be sure, that part looks more like a fable. But yes, he couldn't get out of the tunnel. That's a fact.
No, it's quite true, because since he already knew that he is so important that they will make their best efforts. But here I also want to point out that this issue has already become a little controversial, because there were different confusing narratives surrounding this issue. ISI would always say, I was talking to one of the separatists in Kashmir, and he said that, well, why would ISI want to compromise its entire intelligence base in Nepal just to get one terrorist like Masood Azhar released? Because Nepal in those days was a firm foothold of ISI. They were sending all kinds of militants to Jammu and Kashmir, and also doing the logistics for terror financing and all. But then later, when I did cross-verification and did my own research, I found that Masood was that important that ISI could even compromise and sacrifice its entire base in Nepal. And if you look at the investment made by ISI in IC-814, that was a perfect investment. After that, I know Masood was paraded as a hero in entire Pakistan. ISI flooded Masood Azhar with loads of money to create Jaish-e-Mohammed. Even Al-Qaeda provided the seed funding to create Jaish-e-Mohammed. And since then, Jaish-e-Mohammed is a big menace to India. They have done spectacular Fidayeen missions in the entire subcontinent, and even now continues to be a big threat. And one more question here is that Jaish-e-Mohammed is very distinct and serves the purposes of ISI in a much more effective manner, because Jaish has always maintained that they want to target the entire India, not just Jammu.
Dr. Gunaratne, for long years, terror in India was viewed by experts and common people alike only in terms of the violence that was perpetrated. But very little attention was given to the fact that all that violence and the arms and explosives requires a whole lot of money. Do you think nailing terror financing is the route of fighting terror? And are you satisfied with the kind of steps taken by Pakistan in this context? Because the FATF clearly look satisfied on some day and not satisfied on another day?
Lifeblood of every terrorist organization is terrorist finance. So if they have money, they will prosper. If they don't have money, they will decline. So globally, there are efforts today to control and contain the flow of funds in 4 areas. One is in the collection stage, in the storage stage, in the movement stage, and the dispersal stages. So banks and financial institutions today work with security and intelligence services to control the movement of money towards such entities that either support or engage in terrorism. And I believe that many countries in the Asian region are in a very early stage of doing it, but it will become increasingly more difficult for governments in the event international organizations, especially the Financial Action Task Force and other related entities, take a zero tolerance approach in the fight against terrorism.
Do you think banks, international finance organizations, and other allied institutions, on on grounds of privacy and having a discretion in favor of customers, sometimes can become a hurdle in this investigation?
Privacy and security, governments, international community has to manage both these. When we realize that security is compromised, governments, local law enforcement agencies can go and investigate people's details of people's accounts, can investigate and work with other partners to investigate individuals who are suspicious. So I personally believe that the Swiss banks were once upon a time very famous for maintaining privacy. It is no longer the case. And today, the international community is moving very rapidly and very deeply in a direction where it makes it very difficult for anyone to hide not only money, but also assets. So the new word we are using is not terrorist financing. It is threat financing, because we are looking at the assets, we are looking at other capabilities.
Very interesting. Abhinav Pandya, your book talks about terror financing, terror funding. However, in your research, did you come across the fact that there are a lot of people who have been found by our agencies in Kashmir, across continents, sitting in London, Canada, the US, various other cities of Europe, who are actually supposedly very successful people, considered intellectuals even, white-collar professionals, but whose assets have been found, related in turn to organizations which are then in turn related to terror organizations. Do you have any such instances?
So I must tell you that in a conflict zone, terror funding becomes more like a very organized business, and even the common people, the business class, develop stakes in that. And in my book on Jaish-e-Mohammed, I have discussed the terror funding operations of Jaish in detail. So I've discussed about their charities and their huge, network of Deobandi madrasas from where they're raising money. But then coming to your point, I would like to add that Kashmir is a very complex and a sophisticated terror funding experiment. There you'll find a lot of very, white-collar businessmen, and people who are involved in international trade. They are very, strongly connected to the terror funding network. And I would like to show here that my previous book, Terror Financing in Kashmir, which was released by Routledge, Taylor and Francis, discusses in detail the Kashmir model of terror financing.
Okay.
And you'll be shocked to know that terror financing is not just confined to your formal channels of banks. I mean, they have umpteen number of informal ways. Like in Kashmir, they were raising terror funding by selling MBBS and engineering seats. They were raising terror money by through Hajj tours and travels. Like in each in the small city, you have those little money service businesses and travel agencies. People were traveling to West Asia for their Hajj pilgrimages. So they would charge money from the travelers in Kashmir. That money would be distributed among the terror groups in Kashmir. Definitely a percentage was kept as a commission by the prominent separatist leaders and the travel agents also. But when these travelers would go to West Asia, there they would be taken care of by those actors, the foreign actors who were sponsoring terrorism in Kashmir. And when they would come back, they would give to those travelers the permitted amount of cash or gold, which they can bring back to India under the requirements met by your airline rules and all that. And when they would bring back that cash and gold to India, again, they would be taken by the terror groups and their proxies, the OGWs here in Kashmir. They would be used for terror operations. And I must
So they're
add
acting as carriers. That is what you are trying to explain.
Yes. And I must add that when you talk about terror financing, I mean, we should not just, think in terms of the real money involved in explosions and bombs. There's a huge amount of money that goes in creating and nurturing the ecosystem of terrorism. Like, for example, if you in Kashmir, if you see, Pakistan has invested in the separatist media. They have invested in Islamist organizations like Jamaat-e-Islami, in umpteen number of charities, orphanages, schools, colleges, academia, administration, and in different places.
Dr. Gunaratne, it's easy to go after a terror organizations which is identified as such. But how do you go after people who pose as academics or social workers? There are NGOs, there are people within the media who are very much professionals in a way, but then they are acting as, if I may say, they provide an intellectual cover fire to the actual terror organizations. It's not that straight and easy to go after them for any government, is it?
Every terrorist group operate through front, cover and sympathetic organizations that take the face of human rights, humanitarian, social, cultural, political, educational, NGO and charity organizations. No group will succeed if they only identify themselves by its original names, because everyone will know. So because of this, governments, including the UN, has created a primary list and a secondary list for proscription. Primary list are the names of the terrorist groups. Secondary list are the names by which they now operate that sound very innocuous. So governments must every year investigate, okay, this group, this individual is now operating through these entities. And then designate.
But sir, allow me a cross question here. We all know that Falah-e-Insaniyat and some such charity bodies operating in the Pakistan society for, people helping people during disasters and feeding the poor, etc. They are directly linked to the LET and such organizations. They have never been told to shut their shop.
I personally believe that governments are more aware today of the operation of terrorist groups through front cover and sympathetic organizations. And it is increasingly becoming more difficult for these organizations to operate, because banks will be sanctioned, individuals will be sanctioned, there will be countries that will be sanctioned. So it is in the long-term interests of governments to distance themselves away from terrorism and extremism.
Just time left for one last question. I'll give it to Abhinav Pandya. Abhinav, the good professor just mentioned about proscribing, banning, one thing is to ban individuals, the other is to ban an organization. Now, our own research in this context tells us that it is easier to proscribe an individual, a person as a terrorist, particularly in a global organization like the UN, but it is that much more difficult to brand a whole organization because you need a lot of evidence which may not be so easy to provide. Also, there is politics in the UN when it comes to declaring someone, proscribing someone or some organization. We have seen very dreaded terrorists being blocked by China again and again at the UN because it did not suit its political purpose. Very quickly, what is your understanding of this complex phenomenon? Abhinav.
Well, at the international level, in the FATF, yes, we all agree that it has its own degrees of politics, and when there are other ulterior motives and other considerations. But still, I must say that As far as hardcore terrorist organizations are concerned, it's not that challenging to ban them because there's ample amount of evidence available against them. But yes, as far as taking action against some of these white-collar Islamist groups and charities is concerned, that is a very tricky area and much more challenging because you don't have enough legal mechanisms or even the structures to counter them. So first of all, it has to be realized that simply banning them and proscribing them will not be successful because you'll have a lot of legal challenges. Secondly, if you ban them, they'll come up under some other name and they will continue to operate their activities.
Yeah.
You require a 5-stage mechanism because
Okay.
you must understand that these groups have a strong presence in the society. They have a presence in politics, administration, economy. So they are very widespread and very complex. So you need a 5-stage mechanism to tackle these groups. In my first book, which is Radicalization in India and Exploration, I have discussed the case studies of 2 such groups. First is Jamaat-e-Islami in Kashmir and Popular Front of India in Kerala. So I've discussed in detail like how in 5 different stages you have to tackle these groups, and the proscribing or banning them is the last stage. Before that, you have to go for covert measures. You have to go for like some of their individuals who are the real troublemakers, and so it's a very multi-pronged strategy that you require.
There are always some frontal organizations, who act in favor of these terror bodies, and they are operating within the society. They look very innocuous. Even in the case of the Hamas attack exactly a year ago, there were a lot of people, who were making a lot of a very convincing case about why the Hamas was compelled to do it, etc.
Last point that I would like to make is that, see, as far as international supporters are concerned, fine, that doesn't fall in your domain of, jurisdiction. It's in a different sovereignty. But, as far as the internal system is concerned, you can always, initiate actions against such groups in your territory where you have your legal jurisdiction. Unfortunately, in India, even that part is missing. We have been tolerating several extremist groups like PFI, and until recently we were tolerating them. Even Jamaat-e-Islami, you can just see that some of their former cadres have filed nominations as election candidates in Jammu and Kashmir recently. Now they strictly believe in Maulana Maududi's ideology of political Islam. They have nothing to do with democracy.
Terror is indeed a complex subject, and it has myriad angles which need to be probed into in order to fight this global menace. But for this episode, gentlemen, Professor Rohan Gunaratne and Dr. Abhinav Pandya, both of you, thank you very much for finding the time on a weekend for explaining the complexities of this challenge. And indeed, the developments in West Asia have made it very clear that when terror strikes, it is not going to be confined to a certain city or a district or even a country. It is going to expand its tentacles, proving very, very dangerous for various continents, not just any one place. And therefore, terror needs to be a global fight where all governments, all countries come together. On that hopeful note, it's a wrap up on Media Scan for this weekend. But do join us next weekend for a debate on another national issue. Till then, namaskar.